Psychological testing is a very highly specialized subject in psychology. Psychologists over the years have developed tests for almost every psychological phenomenon they have studied. But a very large number of tests are devoted to two big concepts: intelligence and personality. There is such a large number of tests studying different aspects of personality and different aspects of intelligence that it might be impossible to count the sheer number of tests that have been developed. Just as we have two main topics that we study in psychological testing, we have two main ways in which psychological tests differ from each other. One is the quantitative psychometric test. Quantitative psychometric tests convert psychological phenomena into some kind of a measure first. Let's take the example of depression. The simplest form of depression scale could ask somebody, "How depressed are you? Please rate your depression on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being the least amount of depression and 10 being the highest possible form of depression." So this would be an example of the simplest measure of depression. And as you can see, it would be based on a self-report. Another way you could do it was ask the parent of a child who is depressed and say, "How depressed is your child on a scale of 1 to 10? So here we won't have a self-report, but it would be the report of a parent. And generally in children's tests, we get a lot of reports from parents as well as teachers. So typically for children, usually there are two forms, a parent form and a teacher form. Older children, of course, can answer for themselves also. So we could also have an additional form called the child's form or the adolescent's form. For adults, we usually rely on self-report. And there's a very, very large number of self-report inventories of personality as well as of intelligence. Intelligence tests are not so much reports as they are actual tests, such as those administered in a school or a college or a university setting. So for instance, if you ask somebody a question like, "How much is 7 times 6? There are at least two things to measure there. One is whether or not the answer is correct. It would be 42. The other would be, how long did it take you to answer? So many intelligence tests are not just tests of performance, they're also tests of speed. And speed and intelligence are intrinsically interwoven. One major criticism of these tests of intelligence is that intelligence, because it is about speed, is not the same thing as wisdom, because wisdom requires time. And so people in more traditional societies do not look at speed of responding as an asset, they see it as a problem. And they value slow and steady over the fast and the quick. So that's one criticism. Now, let's move on. What are some of the things that psychological testing considers the most important? One major concern or consideration is that of validity. So in many schools, children write essays in order to answer the question asked by the teacher. Many children memorize those essays and reproduce them exactly. And in traditional schooling, that was considered the right way of attempting a question. And if you followed that, were you actually rewarding knowledge or were you rewarding memory? And that debate is still going on in our schools. Rote memorization is the norm in many schools in the third world. So the issue here is the test measuring what is supposed to measure? We claim that the test is measuring knowledge, whereas the test might be measuring the ability to memorize. So how do we then decide on validity? One form of validity is called criterion validity. Now what happens here is you want to decide whether this test measures depression or not. So here we have this new test that we have developed to measure depression. And we want to know if this test is valid, meaning if this test measures depression and not something else. How do we decide that? What we typically do is we give this test to people who have been labeled, who have been diagnosed by a qualified psychologist or a psychiatrist as having depression. And we also get a group of people who have been cleared by the psychologists as people who do not have depression. So when we administer the same test to these two different groups of people, we should have people who have been diagnosed with depression as having high score on our test, and people who have not been diagnosed with depression or have been cleared of depression should have a low score on a test of depression. And if that happens, we would say that our new test of depression has high or strong criterion validity. And what would be the criterion? Diagnosis by a qualified clinical psychologist or diagnosis by a qualified psychiatrist. Then there is another form of validity which is used by many universities in the United States and Canada. Scholastic aptitude tests, or SATs as they're called for short, or GRE, graduate record examination for PhD admission. What happens there? Over so many years, psychologists first administered those tests to people who were seeking admission to these programs. So SATs were used to help with admission decision into colleges, undergraduate degrees, and GRE tests were used to admit students to postgraduate programs such as master's or PhD. Now, over the years, what we started to notice was that people who had low scores on GREs were unlikely to complete a PhD program. And people who scored very high on the GREs were in fact more likely to complete their PhD program. And a similar phenomenon was noticed with SATs and college performance. Students with high SAT scores performed much better in the university than students with low S scores. And this, therefore, is called predictive validity of a test. So now if somebody has a high score on GRE, you would say, oh, we can safely predict that this person is going to complete their PhD program. The next thing we want to look at is reliability of the test. Meaning, what if I give you the same test after 3 months? Would you score the same? This is called test-retest reliability. And if the test is a good test, chances are situational differences over time would not affect it. So for instance, you come into the room, a test is being given, you perform really well on it. It's a very pleasant day. 3 months later, you go to a different setting and you perform the same test. It's very hot and muggy, sweating, and it affects your morale so much that your performance at the test is poor. So we would say that the test is not very sensitive in terms of measuring that quality. If your performance suffers so much during a retest because of external circumstances, the test is not a very robust measure of whatever it was measuring. Some people may argue and say, no, you have to have the same conditions in which to administer retest. I beg to differ. I would say that a robust test would produce similar results, if not identical, under different circumstances. So, because you see, what is happening is that we are measuring a psychological trait. If, it's like measuring somebody's height or measuring somebody's shoe size. As long as we're not talking about children and talking about adults who don't change very much over the years or over the months, we should be able to have a ruler give us 12 inches even 3 months later. So a ruler that measures 12 inches now should give us 12 inches 3 months later, 12 inches 6 months later, regardless of changes in temperature. That is why rulers are typically made of materials that don't expand and contract very much due to the weather. So now let's talk some more about reliability. Another measure of reliability is the internal consistency of a test. What does that mean? Basically, what that means is that different items of the test are measuring more or less the same phenomena. So, for instance, if I give you a test for anxiety, but there are many items there that are actually measuring depression, chances are that it won't be a very reliable test. So, there are statistical ways of measuring internal consistency of a test, and which in turn is a very strong measure of a test's reliability. And then finally, we develop norms for it. What happens there is that we administer the test to a very large number of people, and we look at the average scores and we set that as a norm. So a depression scale given to a very large number of people should show an average score that is somewhere between highly depressed and not depressed at all. That would then be considered the norm. And then a critical or a cutoff score would be determined, above which people would be considered to be depressed and below which people would be considered not depressed, at least clinically. So this was a quick overview of psychological testing assessment. We will talk about qualitative measures of psychological phenomena in the next lecture. Thank you.